When Jehovah announced the 10th plague that he would bring upon Egypt, he also gave a special order to the Israelites while they were still living under harsh slavery in that land. Through his prophet Moses, God told the Israelites that they should slaughter a young ram or a goat at twilight on the 14th day of the month of Abib, according to the account of Exodus 12, verse 6. We should first point out that in the Hebrew calendar, the day was counted from sunset to the following sunset. The expression at twilight, which in Hebrew literally means between the two evenings, denotes the time just after sunset when the natural light dims, but the evening is not yet completely dark. With regard to the month of Abib, after the exile of the Jews in Babylon, the spring month of Abib had its name changed to Nisan, as this is the name applied to the same month according to the Assyro-Babylonian calendar. Abib, or Nisan, corresponds approximately to the second half of March and the first half of April. It was the first month of the sacred year of the Israelites according to Exodus 12, verse 1, chapter 13, verse 4, and Deuteronomy 16, verse 1. Jehovah further told the Israelites to splash some of the blood of the ram or the goat on the doorposts and the upper part of the doorway of their houses. The Israelites should eat the ram's roasted meat on that very night, along with the unleavened bread and bitter greens or herbs. They should eat it in a hurry and have their feet fastened and sandals on their feet. This order enabled the Israelites to leave Egypt in a haste, as they later did according to the account of Deuteronomy 16, verse 3. Likewise, the order not to leaven the bread was equally important, for the Israelites would have no time to wait for the dough to rise if it was leavened, according to Exodus 12, verse 39. So, this was Jehovah's Passover, according to the account of Exodus 12, verses 1 through 11. What was the meaning of that Passover? The word Passover derives from the Hebrew word Pesach, which conveys the sense of passing over or skipping over in a protective manner. By passing over the homes of the Israelites in Egypt, Jehovah was effectively sparing and protecting them from the plague that he unleashed on every firstborn of the Egyptians. Jehovah explained, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt on this night, that is the 14th of Abib, and strike every firstborn in the land of Egypt, from man to beast. And I will execute judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am Jehovah. The blood will serve as your sign on the houses where you are. And I will see the blood and pass over you, and the plague will not come on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day will serve as a memorial for you, and you must celebrate it as a festival to Jehovah throughout your generations. As a lasting statute, you should celebrate it, according to the account of Exodus 12, verses 12 through 14 in verse 29. He further told the Israelites, "And when you come into the land that Jehovah will give you, just as he has stated, you must keep this observance. And when your sons ask you, 'What does this observance mean to you?' you must say, 'It is the sacrifice of the Passover to Jehovah, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when he plagued the Egyptians, but he spared our houses,' according to Exodus 12, verses 25 through 27. After Jehovah struck down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh got up in the middle of that very night and quickly sent for Moses and Aaron, telling them to take the Israelites and whatever was theirs immediately out of his kingdom. Moreover, the Egyptians themselves began to urge the Israelites to depart quickly, because, as they said, "We are all as good as dead." Exodus 12, verses 30 through 33. Therefore, the Israelites departed, and thenceforth began to celebrate Jehovah's bringing them out of the land of Egypt at the appointed time from year to year, that is, on the 14th day of Abib. On this very day, Jehovah brought the Israelites, along with their multitudes, out of the land of Egypt. The Passover thus became a memorial of their deliverance from Egyptian slavery, according to the accounts of Exodus 12, verses 14, 42, 51, chapter 13, verses 3, 4, and 10, chapter 6, verses 6 through 8, Leviticus 23, verse 5, Numbers 9, verses 2 and 3, Deuteronomy 16, verses 1 through 3. As the Israelites continued their journey in the wilderness towards the promised land, Jehovah gave them further instructions regarding the Passover celebration. He told them, "You will not be allowed to sacrifice the Passover offering in just any of the cities that Jehovah your God is giving you. But it should be done at the place that Jehovah your God chooses to have his name reside. You should sacrifice the Passover offering in the evening as soon as the sun sets at the appointed time of your coming out of Egypt. You must cook it and eat it in the place that Jehovah your God will choose. And in the morning you may return to your own tents," according to Deuteronomy 16, verses 5 through 7. The place where the Israelites would have to celebrate the Passover once they got settled in the Promised Land turned out to be Jerusalem, the city that Jehovah had chosen out of all the tribes of Israel as the place to put his name, according to the accounts of 1 Kings, chapter 11, verse 32, 36, and 14, verse 21. Moreover, the Passover celebration had to be immediately followed by the 7-day festival of unleavened bread, according to Leviticus 23, verses 4 through 8. Eventually, it became mandatory for every male Israelite to travel to Jerusalem 3 times a year to attend these major festivals. The Festival of Unleavened Bread, which included the Passover held on the day before, the Festival of Weeks, better known as the Festival of Pentecost, and the Festival of Booths, or Tabernacles, according to Deuteronomy 16, verse 16, in Exodus 34, verses 23 and 24. Having been born into a family of Jews, Jesus' earthly parents used to leave the Galilean city of Nazareth in which they lived and make those long journeys to Jerusalem with him in order to attend those 3 annual festivals there, according to Luke chapter 2, verse 39 through 43, in Matthew 1, verses 18 through 21. As a natural Jew, born of a Jewish woman, Jesus was also under law even after growing up. Therefore, he never failed to travel to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover and the other mandatory festivals there, according to the accounts of Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, John 2, verses 13, 23, in chapter 5, verse 1, in chapter 7, verses 1, 2, 10, and 14. The last Passover that he celebrated in Jerusalem was held on Nisan 14th, 33 CE. Jesus had the apostles Peter and John get the Passover ready for him and the other apostles. By then, Judas Iscariot had already negotiated with the chief priests the betrayal of Jesus, according to the accounts of Matthew 26, verses 14 through 16, Mark 14, verse 10 and 11, and Luke 22, verses 3 through 6. When the evening fell and Nisan 14 started, Jesus reclined at the table with his 12 apostles, according to the accounts of Matthew 26, verse 20, and Mark 14, verse 17. Jesus first told his apostles that he had greatly desired to eat the Passover with them before his death. However, he would not eat it again until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. All the same, in reference to the cup served at the Passover meal, Jesus pointed out that he would not drink again from the product of the vine until the kingdom of God comes, according to Luke 22, verses 15 through 18. In what special way would that Passover have a fulfillment when the kingdom of God comes? We will provide the Bible answer to that question in one of our upcoming discourses. After Judas Iscariot left the room for good by himself and the Passover meal was just about over, Jesus took a loaf, and after saying a blessing, he broke it, and giving it to the disciples, he said, "Take, eat. This means my body." Matthew 26, verse 26. The parallel account of Luke tells us that Jesus took a loaf, gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This means my body, which is to be given in your behalf. Keep doing this in remembrance of me." Luke 22, verse 19. After all the 11 apostles ate a piece of the emblematic loaf, Jesus did the same with the cup after they had the Passover evening meal, saying, "This cup means the new covenant by virtue of my blood, which is to be poured out in your behalf," according to Luke 22, verse 20. The parallel account of Matthew tells us that taking a cup, Jesus offered thanks and gave it to them, saying, "Drink out of it, all of you, for this means my blood of the covenant, which is to be poured out in behalf of many for forgiveness of sins," according to Matthew 26, verses 27 and 28. We find an additional parallel account in the inspired letter that the Apostle Paul wrote decades later to the Gentile Christians in Corinth. He said, "For I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night on which he was going to be betrayed, took a loaf, and after giving thanks, he broke it and said, 'This means my body, which is in your behalf. Keep doing this in remembrance of me.' He did the same with the cup also, after they had the Passover meal, saying, 'This cup means the new covenant by virtue of my blood. Keep doing this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this loaf and drink this cup, you keep proclaiming the death of the Lord until he comes," according to 1 Corinthians 11, verses 23 through 46 or 26. When the 11 apostles finished partaking of the emblems of the Lord's Supper or evening meal, Jesus began to give counsel and encouragement to them. He also told them that they would all stumble in connection with him on that very night. He further said that before a rooster crowed, Peter would disown him 3 times, according to the accounts of John 13, verses 33 through 38, Matthew 26, verses 31 through 35, Mark 14, verses 27 through 31, and Luke 22, verses 31 through 34. Moreover, an intense argument erupted among the apostles over which of them was the greatest. Jesus patiently gave them a lesson in humility by asking them, "For which one is greater, the one dining or the one serving? Is it not the one dining? But I am among you as the one serving," according to Luke 22, verse 27. And then he added these significant words, "However, you are the ones who have stuck with me in my trials, and I make a covenant with you, just as my Father has made a covenant with me for a kingdom, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and sit on thrones to judge the 12 tribes of Israel," according to Luke 22, verse 24 through 30. From the scriptures just read, we notice that the Lord's Supper has several unique features that distinguish it from the Jewish Passover. To mention just a few, the meal or the supper consists only of an unleavened loaf and a cup of red wine, which are emblematic of Jesus' body and blood offered in sacrifice for forgiveness of sins. For that reason, Jesus did not partake of the emblematic loaf and wine because he had no sin. Only his disciples did. According to John 8:46, Hebrews 4 verse 15, 1 Peter 2 verse 22, and 1 John chapter 3 verse 5. In the original Passover, there was no cup of wine served at the meal, except for the ram's roasted meat, the unleavened bread, and the bitter greens or herbs, according to the account of Exodus 12, verses 5 and 8. How the cup made it later into the Passover meal, as well as the custom of dipping the bread and the bitter greens or herbs into a bowl of brine, vinegar, or sauce during the meal, nobody knows for certain. It seems, though, that these things were adopted after the Jews returned to their land from their exile in Babylon. Nevertheless, the fact that Jesus used a cup during his private Passover celebration is a clear evidence that Jehovah had approved it, according to John 8, verse 29. It must be further noted that the content of the cup served at the Passover meal was not fresh grape juice, for the peak of the grape harvest season was in the summer months of July, August, and September. The Passover celebration occurs 7 months later, in the spring of the following year. Therefore, any grape juice obtained during the summer harvest would have fermented to the point of turning into wine by the next spring. Unlike the Jewish Passover, which was meant to memorialize the deliverance of Israel from Egypt, the Lord's Supper is in remembrance of Jesus' sacrificial death in favor of repentant sinners. Therefore, every time his followers celebrate the Lord's Supper, they are effectively proclaiming or remembering the death of the Lord until he comes as enthroned King, according to Luke 22, verses 18, 19, and 1 Corinthians 11, verses 24 through 26. Furthermore, in the case of the Jewish Passover, only the Israelites or Jews were under obligation to celebrate it and eat its prescribed food items. No foreigner or Gentile was allowed to eat the Passover meal unless he and every male of his family were circumcised. Only then would he become like a native of Israel, according to the account of Exodus 12, verse 43, 44, and 48. But does the same rule also apply to those who partake of the Lord's Supper? Although the Jewish apostles of Jesus were the first partakers of the emblematic loaf and wine when he instituted the celebration of his sacrificial death, by no means it meant that only Jewish Christians would be allowed to do it. The Apostle Paul indicated that in subsequent celebrations, the Jewish or non-Jewish Christians, the Gentile, non-Jewish Christians also partook of the emblems, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, and chapter 11, verse 28. Another important question is when And how often should Christians celebrate the Lord's Supper? Like in the case of the ancient Jewish Passover, they must celebrate the Lord's Supper only once a year at the appointed time, namely on the night of Nisan 14th, as that is the precise date on which Jesus was sacrificed in our behalf according to 1 Corinthians 11 verse 23, Exodus 13 verse 10, and Numbers 9 verses 2 and 3. The loaf was the first emblem that Jesus served to his 11 faithful apostles during the inaugural celebration of his sacrificial death. What did the loaf represent? On the occasion, he told them, "Take, eat. This means my body," according to Matthew 26, verse 26. Another parallel account reads, "This means my body, which is to be given in your behalf," according to Luke 22, verse 19. The loaf thus became an emblem or a representation of Jesus' fleshly body, which would soon be given in behalf of his disciples. When the apostles began to partake of the loaf, it was as if they were also eating Jesus' body in a figurative way. Though even the notion of eating human flesh might be repulsive to most people, the apostles had a correct understanding of what Jesus really meant by those words. After all, it was not the first time that they heard Jesus speak of his body as bread. So, they knew for a fact that Jesus was not promoting any kind of cannibalism among his followers. Why then was it important for the disciples to eat Jesus' body in a figurative way? Just about a year prior, shortly before the Passover in 32 CE, Jesus had shocked a large crowd in a Capernaum synagogue in Galilee when he told them that his body was a kind of bread that all of them should eat in order to live and never die. That was the first time he likened his body to bread. At that time, many of Jesus' own disciples were shocked at those words and stopped following him. Looking at his 12 apostles, he asked if they also wanted to leave him. Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, whom shall we go away to? You have sayings of everlasting life," according to the account of John 6, verses 59 through 61 and 66 through 68. What though had Jesus said that caused such a negative reaction on the part of those who heard him in that synagogue? When some in the crowd said that their ancestors had eaten manna in the wilderness, which they regarded as bread from heaven, Jesus answered them, "Most truly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the one who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world," according to John 6, verses 31 through 33, in chapter 3, verse 16. Notice that this bread of God gives life not only to the chosen Christians, but also to all those of the world of mankind who eat of it and whose hope is to live forever on earth under God's kingdom, according to 1 John 2, verse 2, Matthew 5, verse 5, in Psalm 37, verse 29. By chosen Christians, we refer to those who have been chosen by Jehovah in Jesus Christ to live in heaven and serve as kings and priests during Christ's millennial kingdom, according to Mark 13, verses 20 and 27, 2 Timothy 2, verses 10 through 12, Revelation 5, verses 9 and 10, and chapter 20, verse 6. Jesus went on to say to those crowds in Capernaum, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will not get hungry at all, and whoever exercises faith in me will never get thirsty at all, according to John 6, verse 35. Hence, the bread of life is available to whomever wishes to eat of it. This offer is not restricted to any particular group of Christians. It is available to all. However, it is essential to have faith in Jesus and become a genuine, baptized follower of his steps in order to enjoy the life-giving properties of this spiritual bread. According to John 3:16 and 36, chapter 6, verse 40 and 47, Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20, and 1 Peter 2, verse 21. In his speech, Jesus also added, I am the bread of life. Your forefathers ate the manna in the wilderness, and yet they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that anyone may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever, whether in heaven or on earth. And for a fact, the bread that I will give is my flesh in behalf of the life of the world. John 6:48 through 51. Having no spiritual understanding of what Jesus meant by those words, the Jews began to argue with one another, saying, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? So Jesus said to them, most surely I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in yourselves. Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood has everlasting life, whether in heaven or on earth. And I will resurrect him on the last day, for my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood remains in union with me, and I in union with him. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so also the one who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. It is not as when your forefathers ate and yet died. Whoever feeds on this bread will live forever, whether in heaven or on earth, according to John 6, verse 52 through 58. The scriptures just read, therefore make no distinction whatsoever between the chosen and the unchosen Christians when it comes to the precondition that all of them must eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood in order to have everlasting life, according to John 6, verse 53. There is no exception or exclusion applied to either the chosen or the unchosen. Since the precondition is applied to everybody, then nobody has the right to exclude the other from fulfilling it as well. By partaking of the emblematic loaf and wine during the celebration of the Lord's Supper or evening meal, a genuine Christian demonstrates that he has faith in Jesus Christ and relies entirely on the merit of his sacrifice to have everlasting life. For that reason, he feeds on Jesus' flesh and drinks his blood in a figurative way during the supper. The food that someone eats to stay alive also becomes part of him when its nutrients are assimilated in his body. Likewise, feeding on Jesus Christ's flesh and drinking his blood in a figurative way keeps the person spiritually alive and also demonstrates that he is in union with Jesus and that Jesus is in union with him, according to John 6, verse 56 and 57. Jesus kindly shares the sacrificial benefits of his perfect body and blood with anyone who wishes to feed on them, according to John 6, verse 35, 54, and 55. In imitation of Jesus, we should also share with others the privilege of feeding on his body and drinking his blood in a figurative way. Failing to do that would be unloving and selfish on our part. Paul wrote, "The cup of blessing that we bless and pass on to others among us during the Lord's Supper, is it not a sharing or participation in the blood of the Christ? The loaf that we break and pass on to others among us during the Lord's Supper, is it not a sharing or participation in the body of the Christ?" 1 Corinthians 10, verse 16. What Paul was saying is that when our brothers in Corinth partook together of the emblems during the Lord's Supper, they were in reality engaging in a sharing of the body and blood of Christ with one another. Paul also added that even though the partakers may be many and the loaf served is just one, they still share it among themselves, for they are just one body as well, according to 1 Corinthians 10, verse 17. In other words, there are no two groups of partakers and non-partakers of the emblems. They are all partakers. After the 11 faithful apostles ate of the emblematic loaf, Jesus took a cup, offered thanks, and gave it to them, saying, "Drink out of it, all of you, for this means my blood of the covenant, which is to be poured out in behalf of many for forgiveness of sins." In his parallel account, Mark tells us, "And taking the cup, he offered thanks and gave it to them, and they all drank out of it. And he said to them, this means my blood of the covenant, which is to be poured out in behalf of many." Mark 14, verse 23 and 24. Luke writes, "Also he did the same with the cup after they had the Passover evening meal, saying, this cup means the new covenant by virtue of my blood, which is to be poured out in your behalf," according to Luke 22, verse 20. Therefore, the cup of wine was an emblem or a representation of Jesus' blood of the covenant, which would be poured out in behalf of many for forgiveness of sins. Notice that the purpose of the blood of the covenant, or the new covenant by virtue of Christ's blood, is not to anoint or choose a Christian to go to heaven, but exclusively to forgive sins. Nevertheless, the first time the expression blood of the covenant was used in the scriptures was in connection with another event that had occurred 15 centuries prior. After Jehovah released the Israelites from the Egyptian slavery, he made a covenant or a contract with them as they were camped in the wilderness near Mount Sinai. Jehovah had angels communicate with Moses and pass on to him the laws that should govern the nation of Israel, according to Acts 7, verse 37-38, and Galatians 3, verse 19. The inspired account tells us, then Moses came and related to the people all the words of Jehovah and all the judicial decisions. And though the people answered with one voice, all the words that Jehovah has spoken, we are willing to do. So Moses wrote down all the words of Jehovah. Then he got up early in the morning and built at the foot of the mountain an altar and 12 pillars corresponding to the 12 tribes of Israel. After that, he sent young Israelite men, and they offered up burnt offerings and sacrificed bulls as communion sacrifices to Jehovah. Then Moses took half of the blood and put it in bowls, and half the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it aloud to the people. And they said, all that Jehovah has spoken we are willing to do, and we will be obedient. So Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, this is the blood of the covenant that Jehovah has made with you in harmony with all these words, according to Exodus 24, verses 3 through 8. The words written in the book of the covenant were the laws that should govern the Israelites, which they solemnly pledged to obey. For that reason, many people refer to this arrangement as the law covenant. The covenant between Jehovah and the nation of Israel was now in force. Moses acted as a mediator between the two parties, according to Exodus 20:19, Deuteronomy 5, verse 5, and John 1, verse 17. Nevertheless, for the covenant to become legally binding, it took the shedding of blood. Paul explained. Consequently, neither was the former covenant put into effect without blood. For when Moses had spoken every commandment of the law to the people, he took the blood of the young bulls and of the goats with water, scarlet wool, and hyssop, and sprinkled the book and all the people, saying, this is the blood of the covenant that God has commanded you to keep, according to Hebrews 9, verses 18 through 20. However, even before the Israelites took possession of the land that Jehovah had promised to them, he noticed that they had developed a different inclination, according to Deuteronomy 31, verse 21. Therefore he said to Moses, look, you're about to die, and this people will begin to commit spiritual prostitution with the foreign gods that are around them in the land to which they are going. They will forsake me and break my covenant that I have made with them, according to Deuteronomy 31, verse 16. Israel's later history proves that they did not keep the covenant of God and refused to walk in his law, according to Psalm 78, verse 10. Another record says, thus they abandoned Jehovah, the God of their fathers, who brought them out of the land of Egypt. And they followed other gods, the gods of the peoples who were all around them, and they bowed down to them and offended Jehovah, according to the account of Judges 2, verse 12. Therefore it was the Israelites, not Jehovah, who unilaterally broke the covenant between them. However, despite Israel's countless violations of the covenant, Jehovah made this cheerful promise. Look, the days are coming, declares Jehovah, when I will make with the house of Israel and the house of Judah a new covenant. It will not be like the covenant that I made with their forefathers on the day I took hold of their hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant that they broke, although I was their true master, declares Jehovah. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after these days, declares Jehovah. I will put my law within them, and in their heart I will write it. And I will become their God, and they will become my people, for I will forgive their error, and I will no longer remember their sin. Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34. Why would Jehovah do that? This is what Jehovah says. If the heavens above could be measured and the foundations of the earth below could be explored, only then could I reject all the offspring of Israel for all they have done, declares Jehovah at Jeremiah 31, verse 37. Firstly, the scriptures just read showed that the main object of the promised new covenant was to forgive the sins of those who were under the former covenant, namely the natural Israelites, according to Hebrews 8, verses 8 and 12, and chapter 9, verse 15. Secondly, the scriptures provide a divine assurance that at least with some of the natural offspring of Israel, Jehovah would still be able to make that new covenant, whereby he would forgive their sins committed under the former covenant. In this manner, the natural offspring of Israel would not be entirely rejected. The Apostle Paul agrees with this when he says, I ask then, God did not reject his people, did he? By no means, for I too am an Israelite of the offspring of Abraham, from the tribe of Benjamin. God did not reject his people, whom he first recognized. Romans 11, verses 1 and 2. Paul was already a baptized Christian when he wrote this. At the time, there were also thousands of other natural Jews who had become Christians before him. Nevertheless, they were all part of the natural offspring of Israel, with whom Jehovah made the new covenant, according to Acts 2, verses 5, 22, and 36 through 38, and verse 41, in chapter 3, verses 12 through 15, in verses 19 and 20, and chapter 4, verse 4. Paul further said, Moreover, Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, although the number of the sons of Israel may be as the sand of the sea, only the remnant of Israel's natural offspring will be saved. Also, just as Isaiah foretold, unless Jehovah of armies had left an offspring to us, natural Israelites, we should have become just like Sodom, and we should have resembled Gomorrah, according to Romans 9, 27, 29. In fact, in Paul's day, there was a remnant of the natural offspring of Israel that had been chosen through God's undeserved kindness, according to Romans 11 verse 5 and James 1 verse 1. Though it is true that the vast majority of the Jews in the first century CE did not accept Jesus as their promised Messiah and Savior, a few thousands did, and they certainly were included in the new covenant with Jehovah, according to John 1 verses 11 through 13 and Isaiah 53 verses 3 and 12. The Apostle Paul explained that unless blood is poured out, no forgiveness takes place, according to Hebrews 9:22. He further said that it is impossible for the blood of bulls and of goats to take sins away, according to Hebrews 10 verse 4. Why? Because the blood of animals has not the same value as that of humans, and therefore it is unable to take sins away completely, according to Hebrews 10 verse 11. Accordingly, the new covenant with the natural offspring of Israel would have to come into force by virtue of Jesus' blood, as only He could provide the corresponding ransom for all sinners, according to Luke 22 verse 20 and 1 Timothy 2 verse 5 and 6. Moreover, only the sacrifice of Jesus' perfect, sinless body in the pouring out of His vital blood would be able to do away with the sins of repentant ones on a permanent basis, according to Hebrews 10 verses 10, 12, 14, and chapter 9 verse 12. For that reason, the new covenant is a better covenant than the previous one. As Paul explains, Jesus has obtained a more excellent ministry than Moses because he is also the mediator of a correspondingly better covenant, which has been legally established on better promises, according to Hebrews 8, verse 6, and chapter 7, verse 22. Paul further tells us that Jesus became a perpetual high priest after his resurrection and ascension back to heaven, according to Hebrews 4, verses 14 through 16, chapter 5, verses 5 and 6 and 10, chapter 7, verses 26, 27, and chapter 8, verse 1. After Jesus presented the value of his sacrificial blood to his Father in heaven, the new covenant took effect and canceled the old one with the nation of Israel, according to Hebrews 9, verses 11 and 12, chapter 8, verse 13, and 1 Peter 2, verse 24. From then on, all the natural Jews who had faith in Jesus and in his sacrificial death were no longer under the strict authority of the old law covenant, for it had been taken out of the way and nailed to the execution stake with Christ, thus coming to its end, according to Romans 10, verse 4, and Colossians 2, verse 14. In our next video, we will talk more about the new covenant and the everlasting benefits that will be enjoyed by all the Jews and Gentiles who take part in this divine arrangement for the forgiveness of sins on the basis of Jesus Christ's sacrificial death. Take this opportunity to subscribe to our channel and feel free to communicate with us through our email. You will find it in the brief description that we make regarding the purpose of our channel. Thank you for your kind attention.